For a while now, I've been making videos in which I take characters from the Thomas & Friends TV series and redraw them in the Railway series style, creating a new backstory that I try and make fit within the pre-established lore. However, the TV series wasn't the only other avenue of the Thomas franchise to have its own set of original characters not present in the books. The Thomas & Friends magazine, originally published by Marvel and later Egmont, had a handful of characters created exclusively for it as well, and today we'll be having a look at 3 of them as I draw new artwork. Let's begin! Flying Thistle is one of the earliest characters to have been created for the Thomas magazine. He is an LNER Gresley A1/A3 Pacific, similar to Gordon and Flying Scotsman. Personally, I find Flying Thistle to be quite an interesting character, not necessarily due to his personality or in-universe backstory, but rather the quirks and unanswered questions surrounding his existence. For starters, he only appears in one magazine story, The Visitor, but for a long time it was speculated that he appeared in another story where Bill and Ben mistake him for Gordon. This was from back in the era where there was virtually no documentation surrounding the Thomas magazine, and so a lot of what was stated about the magazine on the internet was just made up. There's also the fact that, in his single appearance, he doesn't have a face and doesn't speak, despite unambiguously being alive. In the original illustrations, however, he is depicted with a face. I don't think I've heard anyone speculate as to why Flying Thistle's face was removed last minute. Whilst I can't say for certain what the reason could have been, I do have a theory as to what may have happened. The one story that featured Flying Thistle was published in 1992. At the time, Thomas & Friends was still partially owned by the Audrey family, and so I wonder if there was perhaps a rule that new engine characters not created by the Audreys could not be introduced to the franchise, or at least not without approval from the Audreys. There were a good number of magazine-exclusive engine characters, but all of the ones introduced during the magazine's earlier years were faceless. The first ones to be illustrated with faces started cropping up in 1998, by which point Thomas was fully owned by the Britt Allcroft Company. If this rule about requiring approval from the Audrey family did exist, it would have stopped being a thing by this point. I suppose one potential hole in this theory is the existence of Smudger, who was created for the TV series back when the Audrey family still partially owned Thomas. Either the TV series team got clearance from the Audreys, or Smudger was considered to be the same character as the Mid-Cylinder Railway Stanley and not a brand new engine. Anyway, enough speculation about a rule that may or may not have existed. It's time to talk about my take on Flying Thistle. So as not to clash with enterprising engines, where Flying Scotsman is stated to be Gordon's sole surviving brother, Flying Thistle didn't enter preservation until sometime after 1967. Flying Thistle originally went under the name Knight of the Thistle and was withdrawn from service in 1964. Following his withdrawal, he would journey from shed to shed across the network to avoid being noticed, as his crew and the people closest to him didn't want him to get scrapped. He was eventually found and purchased by a group of enthusiasts who gave him a new identity. By now we're in the late 60s or early 70s. During this era, preserved locomotives couldn't be painted up in British Railways colours because it had to be made clear that they weren't BR owned. Thistle's owners decided to paint their engine into red, to contrast against the colours of the 2 other preserved Gresley A1s, Gordon's blue and Flying Scotsman's green. For the longest time, Flying Thistle mainly headed rail tours, rarely visiting preserved railways. In 1992, to celebrate Gordon's 70th birthday, Flying Thistle, along with Flying Scotsman, were invited to visit Sodor to partake in a special event reminiscent of the Great Gathering. It had been so long since Flying Thistle had interacted with so many other steam engines, and he mainly stuck to talking to his brothers. I'm sorry to say that this wasn't out of shyness, but rather snootiness. Thistle fancied himself a celebrity and didn't fancy mingling with what he deemed the more common, lowly types, some of which were tank engines. Even when Gordon and Flying Scotsman encouraged him to talk with the other Sodor engines, Thistle didn't budge. This was until he broke down on the main line, and the only engine that could come to his rescue was Donald. After conversing with Donald during their trip to the works, Flying Thistle learned that he had more in common with the other engines than he'd originally thought, and vowed to become a more accepting engine. When not rail touring, he now makes frequent visits to smaller preserved branch lines, often making friends with the smaller engines that keep the lines running. And, with that said and done, here is the finished drawing. Out of the 3 engines featured in this video, 13 is the only one I specifically remember reading about in the magazines at the time. Not really knowing the significance of the number 13 in relation to bad luck, I mainly just remember wondering to myself, who's number 12 then? If you've watched my earlier videos, you'll know that in my own lore I've allocated the number 12 to Rosie. You may also remember that I correctly allocated the number 13 to Barry and gave Walter the Austerity the number 14. This is where things get a bit confusing, but I'll try to explain as clearly as I can. In the video on Aubrey and Rika, I made Rika the number 15, but since she arrived on Sodor in the 1970s, before Barry or Walter, there has to have been an earlier number 13 and 14 that worked on the North Western Railway and left before the arrival of Barry and Walter respectively. My thinking is that 13 was the North Western Railway's original number 13 and arrived on the island around 1970. He was a one-off design built by Nielsen and is similar to their 040 saddle tank engines, but with the extended frames to accommodate a set of trailing wheels, as well as a rear coal bunker. The final result looks similar to a Caledonian Railway 262 class locomotive. This experimental design was built with the intention of hauling trains for a longer distance without the need for a separate tender, but the design itself suffered from steaming problems. 13's actual name is Alexander, or Wiek, as he was nicknamed by the workers at the blast furnace he was originally stationed at. As he mainly shunted trucks around the premises, his steaming issues weren't generally apparent, although mishaps tended to occur when he was around, resulting in one employee disparagingly chalking the number 13 on the side of his saddle tank. When the blast furnace closed down, the Fat Controller, admitting himself to being a sucker for oddities, was interested in purchasing the one-off Nielsen locomotive. The chalk inscription on Alexander's tank became his official running number when acquired by the North Western. This was when his steaming problems became more noticeable. He was stationed on the Little Western to help Donald and Douglas with goods work whilst Duck was unavailable. He struggled with even the shorter goods trains, meaning that Donald and Douglas often had to come to his rescue even when they were busy elsewhere. Oliver had to help with the goods work alongside his own passenger trains as well. Sometimes Alexander could do the work himself, and sometimes he couldn't. It all seemed to depend on luck. One cold November morning, Alexander was feeling confident. He was able to make it out of the station with a full train, but by the time he got to the coastal area, he was feeling weak. He took solace in the fact that much of the remaining journey was downhill, but had reckoned without the reckless nature of the ballast trucks. He went too fast, toppled off the rails and tumbled down the embankment. When the breakdown gang arrived, the Fat Controller was with them. To Alexander's surprise, he didn't look cross. In fact, he was sympathetic. The Fat Controller explained to Alexander that he was to be overhauled at the works to have his steaming troubles amended. When Alexander came back from the works, he had an easier time steaming. But he was still lacking in confidence. He had gone for repairs many times back at the old blast furnace, and yet it never seemed to avert his bad luck. So why should this be any different? He mainly stuck to shunting for a while as Donald, Douglas and Oliver pulled the bulk of the trains. However, one day Oliver fell ill, and Donald and Douglas were busy on Edward's branch line. Alexander had to take the ballast train himself. It was a cold, wet, windy day, similar to the day when he had had his accident. As he approached the coastal line, he saw a landslide form on the track ahead of him. He applied his brakes, which worked much better than before, now that he'd had his rebuild. He stopped in front of the landslide, and his driver, fireman and guard all congratulated him for preventing a nasty crash. Now Alexander was feeling a lot more confident. Perhaps the number 13 wasn't so unlucky after all. Duck returned a few weeks later. Alexander still helped out on the Little Western from time to time, but now that there were enough engines to go around on the Little Western, he spent the next few years helping out on various different parts of the railway, including several other branch lines as well as various yards. Around 1980 he was sold to a heritage railway in Scotland, where he continues to haul both passenger trains and goods trains for photo charters. But with all that said, here is the completed image. The final engine we'll be talking about today is Sidney. No, not that Sidney. And definitely not that Sidney. This Sidney appeared in 2 magazine stories in the late 90s. His most prominent appearance was in a story called The Scenic Railway, in which Duck has to deliver Sidney to his new home, the Scenic Railway in question, and Sidney boasts that his new railway is the most scenic one on the island. Duck responds by taking Sidney on a grand tour of all the most picturesque areas on the island. Sidney is humbled and decides that maybe there are things to enjoy about the scenery of all of Sodor's lines. I guess it's a bit like Thomas and Skarloey's Big Day Out, but 8 years earlier. Sidney's railway connects with the Little Western, which leads me to believe that, if Sidney was a Railway series character, his railway may actually be the Arlesdale Railway. In the magazine illustrations, he looks more in line with the engines of the Skarloey Railway, but it could be a situation similar to the Fairbourne Railway, which is a miniature railway, but all the engines are half-size replicas of 2-foot narrow gauge engines. The same could ring true for Sidney. In the illustrations it's hard to know exactly what type of engine he's based on, but in the end I decided to base him on the Peckett locomotive Jurassic, albeit obviously much smaller so that he can run on the Arlesdale Railway. Similar to his magazine counterpart, Sidney was originally boastful, believing that the Arlesdale Railway must be the most scenic railway of them all due to the sheer number of people who come to visit the railway from all over the island and beyond. But he is soon brought down to size when he discovers that many of those visitors are also there to see the sights on the standard gauge line, and some of them even have day rover tickets that can be used on any of the island's railways. Sidney learns that there are reasons for people to visit all of the lines on Sodor that don't relate back to the Arlesdale Railway. And so, here is the completed drawing. And there we are, some characters from the Thomas & Friends magazines adapted into the Railway series style. There are a fairly sizable number of characters introduced in the magazines, so I will more than likely make follow-ups to this video at some point. Until then, be sure to subscribe, leave a like or a comment, and I'll see you very soon.